Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about is the democratic crisis in Israel. It is time to finally explain in clear language what the upheaval in the streets of Israel is all about. And it's time to explain with no emotional undertones what comes next on the agenda of judicial reform. I'm about to give you a spoiler alert. If you think these protests were heated, you ain't seen nothing yet. Prepare yourselves for the next set of reforms. To date, the pictures we've seen and the speechifying we've heard, both for and against judicial reform in Israel, have, for the most part, been hyperbole. The hotly debated law just presented to Israel's Knesset and passed by that same body of 120, only 64 voted for. The others left. Was just a tiny segment of the judicial reform bill originally presented to Israel's Knesset, their parliament. Prime Minister Netanyahu separated the unreasonableness clause from the larger package because it was easier to sell in fragments, and because that segment was, he reasoned, less problematic than the next section. So what's in that next section, the more problematic one? Well, the who and the how of selecting and promoting judges. That section has, understandably, proven thus far to be more prickly and far more emotion-laden than what we have witnessed up until now. Given its ambiguous title, it is important to understand exactly what the unreasonableness clause was and is. Unreasonableness was a test that the Israeli Supreme Court used to evaluate cases where no law was germane or specific, especially regarding actions of political leaders and political bureaucrats who may have overstepped their authority. It's a standard, let's say, for instance. For example, Aryeh Deri, a longtime political figure in Israeli society under the Shas party. He was a rainmaker and oftentimes a member of Knesset. He was also a minister. He was twice convicted while serving in the Knesset. Twice. He was convicted of corruption and tax fraud. Before his second conviction, Deri rapidly resigned from the Knesset, so the moral turpitude rule, which would have prevented him from holding office for 7 years, would not kick in. But in his settlement and sentencing hearing, he agreed that he would no longer serve in Israel's government. He was handed a 3-year jail sentence. Some of it was done, obviously, afterwards. That was in the year 2000. Now fast forward 20 years, Deri was elected once again in 2022. He was appointed Minister of Health and Deputy Prime Minister in January 2023. Aryeh Deri claimed that his plea agreement encompassed only the government that was in power at the time of his conviction and sentencing, not the present government or any other new government. The Supreme Court ruled no and forced Prime Minister Netanyahu to fire his minister, Aryeh Deri. It was the unreasonableness standard that gave the highest ranking justices in the country the authority to overrule the Prime Minister and force the replacement of a minister. The court ruled that it was unreasonable to conclude that Deri's agreement was intended for the moment in time only, just that moment. The court ruled that Deri could remain in the Knesset because he was elected duly, but he could not serve as minister because that is an appointed position. And his plea agreement actually said that. Israel's unreasonableness rule should not be unfamiliar to citizens in the United States. It's not dissimilar to the United States super constitutional rule, which is called judicial review. When in 1803, U.S. Supreme Court in Marbury versus Madison took upon itself powers not defined in the Constitution to strike down a law that was unconstitutional under the Supremacy Clause of Article 6. In his decision, U.S. Chief Justice John Marshall ruled that judicial review gives the court, what was known then as the Marshall Court, new powers and strength that made the court actually an equal partner in the checks and balances of the United States government. They became much stronger because of it. Another U.S. rule, also very similar to the unreasonableness rule, in Israel is called the rational basis review. This rule was first applied by Oliver Wendell Holmes in a famous dissenting opinion in 1905. He writes, "The word liberty in the 14th Amendment is perverted when it is held to prevent the natural outcome of a dominant opinion unless it can be said that a rational and fair man necessarily would admit that the statute proposed would infringe fundamental principles as they have been understood by the traditions of our people and our law." In other words, what would a normal person infer? Is it rational? Is it reasonable? Reasonableness clause? This reform is minuscule relative to the next stage, reforming the Judicial Selection Committee. As of now, the Judicial Selection Committee is composed of members of the Bar Association and of judges. They are tasked with selecting judges and elevating judges to higher courts. In many instances, these judges were choosing their own replacements. Reformers rightly point out the numerous problems in having judges select judges and having a committee without any accountability to the voters. One reform implemented was to add a member from both opposition and governing coalition from the Knesset to the selection committee. That's already been done, and there was no real problem with either of those appointments. Two additional people, each of whom was elected to Knesset, joining the other members of the committee who are academics and judges. No diversity. A narrow, tiny sliver of Israel's elite could be a problem. About this segment of Israel's judicial reform, I have neither seen nor heard any suggested compromise. Just a time freeze. A freeze does not solve the issue. It allows time to discuss potential compromises. Reformers want a new committee. Anti-reformers want things to remain as it is. Their position is that if the committee were to reflect the Knesset, it is a rubber stamp for the governing party, and that's understandable. And that means that the legal system will become politicized. The law will be political. This is where the big problem rests. What we have witnessed so far will look like child's play, but it is the beginning of the end of the democratic process in Israel? I don't think so. I believe it is an exercise in democracy, not the demolition of democracy. Coming up next, points of view. First up is a column from the New York Post. It was published on July 23rd, 2023, and was written by Alan Dershowitz and Andrew Stein. They write columns together now all the time. Why French and US protests are so much more violent than Israel's. That's the title. The subtitle is, Israel and France have both been flooded with mass protests in recent weeks, but the differences are striking, telling, and important. The authors are correctly asking the following question: why all the coverage of Israel and the condemnation of Israel while there has been such violence on the streets of Paris? It's almost gone unnoticed in the US media. This is how the authors begin. Demonstrations in Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and throughout Israel against the proposed judicial reforms have been peaceful and generally orderly. Israeli lawmakers are expected to pass the first part of the plan to overhaul courts Monday, with a bill that would bar the Supreme Court from invalidating government decisions simply because judges find them unreasonable. Despite the calls for civil disobedience by some former prime ministers and other protest leaders, there has been little to no violence. Passions are high and tempers have flared, but no one has been seriously injured and no buildings have been burned or destroyed. This may change over time as extremists on both sides move further apart and eschew reasonable compromises Israeli President Isaac Herzog and other centrists offer. Now the authors compliment the protests in Israel, and they explain just exactly what is unique about Israel and its protests. They write, at the moment, despite the anger and even hatred, the Israeli protests have been models for what our First Amendment guarantees: the right of the people peaceably to assemble and petition government for a redress of grievance. Demonstrations in Paris and other French cities, prompted by the police shooting of a young Arab man, quickly turned violent. with the desecration of a memorial to Jews deported to their deaths during the Holocaust, burned buildings and cars, rioting and injuries. The authors again ask about the differences in the coverage. And they're right to ask this very question because they continue. What are the possible explanations for these differences? But Israelis also regard their protests as involving life and death issues, such as the proper role of courts in constraining military and police responses to terrorism against innocent civilians, and the obligation of all citizens to risk their lives by being drafted into military service. The stakes are high in all these protests in different parts of the world, but the level of violence is quite different. Another possible explanation may be found in the fact that the protesters themselves are different in the different countries. In Israel, they cross ethnic, religious, and political lines. Although many of the protesters are secular, Ashkenazi of European heritage, residents of Tel Aviv, and anti-Netanyahu, a considerable number are religious, Sephardi, that is, of Middle Eastern heritage, residents of Jerusalem, and conservative brothers, sisters, and neighbors, and friends are on different sides of the protests and counter-protests. In France, and to a somewhat lesser degree in the United States, the protesters tended to be members of disaffected minority groups, with grievances against the country as a whole and its institutions. Their goals are to destabilize our Republican institutions and bring blood and fire down on France, the Interior Minister said of previous protests this year. While "burn it all down" has been a frequent slogan at US demonstrations, most of the Israeli protesters, on the other hand, are Zionists who love their country and are trying to prevent policies that they believe will damage their beloved Israel. The conclusion of these authors comes to understanding, and we see it is clear. The three great democracies, United States, Israel, and France, are increasingly fractured and divided along political, religious, and racial lines. There will be more protests as the divisions get worse, and as often predictable events serve as provocations. The democratic world should learn from Israel that protests can be an important aspect of the democratic governance as long as they remain non-violent. This is very, very well said and very, very well written. Excellent piece. Thank you very much, Dershowitz and Stein. Next up is a column by Ronald Lauder. The column is the former ambassador's appeal to Israel to unite. This piece was published in Ynet on July 27th, 2023. It's entitled World Jewish Congress President, National Unity Now. Subtitle, Opinion: As I watch Israel tear itself apart while its enemies grow in strength, I must take a stand and speak up. Only Netanyahu, Lapid, and Gantz can bring about unity, and it's time to rise to the historic challenge. Lauder's entire piece is a plea for Israeli leadership to wake up and work towards compromise and unity. The risk, he writes, are too high. This is how Ronald Lauder begins. We, the Jews of the diaspora, usually refrain from meddling in Israeli politics. We love Israel, and we are committed to Israel, but we are always cautious to respect sovereignty. But today, Israel's future hangs in the balance. The Jewish people's one and only state is facing imminent existential danger, a combination of unprecedented external and internal threats has brought Israel to the brink. The external threat has three dimensions. Over the last year, Iran has amassed enough nuclear material for several nuclear weapons, according to the United Nations, and soon could pose a direct threat to Israel's security. Hezbollah is turning into one of the most dangerous and powerful terrorist organizations in the world. It has acquired the ability to attack Haifa, Tel Aviv, Jerusalem. The Palestinian Authority's legitimacy is being undermined by Hamas and other radical forces. Consequently, the West Bank is heading towards chaos and violence. Lauder admits that Israel is strong, but this internal division weakens Israel especially the way Israel is perceived by her enemies. He continues, true, Israel is strong. If challenged, it will fight back fiercely and win. But the three dimensions of the external threat are creating a new regional reality. The danger of a multi-front war is greater than it has been for decades. But Israel also faces an unprecedented internal threat comprising three dimensions. He explained why it is so important for him to break his silence now and appeal to Israel, and this is how he writes. This is the reason a Jewish leader like myself can no longer keep quiet as I watch Israel tear itself apart while its enemies grow in strength. I must take a stand and speak up. A house divided against itself cannot stand, said Abraham Lincoln before the American Civil War. Neither can an Israel divided against itself. As Jews, we must learn from our tragic history. Throughout its history, Israel has done wonders while making the desert bloom and providing safe haven to millions of Jewish survivors and refugees. It overcame most of its enemies and reached peace with 6 Arab nations. But the challenge of our time and our generation is internal division, and the only way to confront it is to renew the alliance between the major Zionist forces. Lowther concludes by writing that it is essential to act now to reduce the internal tensions. In his words, at this crucial juncture, world Jewry turns its eyes to the Jewish state, praying for its survival and beseeching it to heal the rupture, tearing it apart from within. Hence, as the president of the World Jewish Congress, I call upon Netanyahu, Lapid, and Gantz to rise to the historic challenge. As a Jew who knows them well and loves Israel, I tell them they have no other choice. Not only the Jews of the diaspora, but the resounding majority of Israelis and 3,000 years of Jewish history are calling on the Jewish state to unite. There is only one choice. The writing is on the wall. Coming up, commentary through cartoons where pictures tell the story. I want to show you 8 cartoons and memes today. No headlines today. It's a unique day for me. This first cartoon is funny and sad at the very same time. The headline reads, Public School Attendance Low, with an arrow pointing down. A teacher is quoting Woody Allen saying, 80% of success is showing up. A student raises his hand and asks 2 follow-up questions. Who's Woody Allen? And the other 10%? That's sad. This next cartoon is of a protest. The protesters are chanting, what do we want? And the answer is, delayed gratification. When do we want it? And the last panel box is empty. They got what they wanted. They got delayed gratification. As of now, and as most of you know, there is a new variant going around. It is indeed the late summer COVID wave. And here we can see COVID catching a wave on the surfboard. It's certainly putting a damper on many people's summer plans. Up next is a perfect depiction of Putin in the Black Sea as a sea monster. Putin is trying to control the water to prevent Ukraine from exporting wheat. This is a bad situation for the world. About 25% of the world's wheat is grown in Russia and Ukraine. Next up is a brilliant interpretation of how AI is becoming relative to real artists, a huge monster. AI is a monster, and the artist is a tiny, tiny figure in its shadow. This next cartoon depicts a split in Israel. Bibi is splitting Israel, symbolized by the Israeli flag, like Moses split the Red Sea. And his staff has a sign that signifies no U-turn, which means there's no turning back on these reforms. I'll agree with that, by the way. And finally, this last meme is about emojis. An emoji is a pictogram or an ideogram. An emoji is a picture that expresses an emotion. It's a made-up word that combines image and emotion together. If I had made up the word, I would have spelled it with an I, not an E. Therefore, with the E, it places much more of an emphasis on the emotion part as opposed to the image part. With an I, it would have placed a little bit more emphasis on image. The meme suggests that before emojis, there was the inimitable Lucille Ball in her iconic role as I Love Lucy. The comedy ran on CBS from 51 to 57, 180 episodes. Lucy and Desi Arnaz were real live husband and wife, but they set the tone for humor. They revolutionized humor on TV. In I Love Lucy, Lucille Ball actually has so many expressions and facial expressions that they capture almost all the expressions of the emojis. Take a look. In a moment, more of my own perspective and a few predictions. The Shin Bet announced that it has uncovered an Iranian phishing campaign designed to gather information about Israelis. That's phishing with a PH, not with an F. It's a fraudulent way of obtaining information from unsuspecting targets via the computer. In this case, Iranian representatives posing as conference organizers contacted Israeli civil servants and researchers, academics, through fake profiles on LinkedIn to obtain their private information. These same officials took over the Israelis' computers through fake invitations to the conferences. Once the Israelis clicked on the invitations, the Iranians were able to have total access of the Israelis' computers through malicious spyware. Before the start of the summer recess, the government of Israel approved the establishment of an interministerial committee to build a plan to aid the absorption of the B'nai Menashe community. B'nai Menashe is actually a community of Indian Jews living on the border of India and Burma. They are caught right now in a civil war between local Meitei and Kuki tribes in northeastern India. According to the Minister of Immigration and Absorption, Ophir Sofer, who initiated the establishment of the committee, the program is expected to help the absorption of B'nai Menashe and bring them to Israel in the next 4 months. Likud MK and former Speaker of Knesset, Yuli Edelstein, said he won't automatically support the government's passing of additional legislation in the judicial overhaul without Israel reaching a wider consensus for further moves. While being interviewed by Ynet, member of Knesset Edelstein said, "I let everyone know that upcoming legislation on judicial reform will have to be presented to me fully before I'll decide whether to support them or not." Edelstein also said that any forging relations with Saudi Arabia did not appear imminent on the horizon, disputing US President Joe Biden's prediction last week that possible rapprochement between the Middle East powers will be happening soon. Now, you should note, he's the head of the Knesset Foreign Affairs Committee and Defense Committee, and he's a senior member of Prime Minister Netanyahu's Likud. He told Army Radio that he thinks it's too early to talk about the deal being in the works. A 13-year-old Jewish boy was attacked in France by 3 people because of his Jewish religious appearance. According to police report, his attackers threatened to kill him, the 13-year-old boy, and promised to take revenge on him if he filed a complaint with the police. That very same day, a 65-year-old Jewish man was attacked in the United States after leaving a Chabad house in San Diego. As part of this attack, the attackers tore off the man's tzitzit and shouted anti-Semitic, anti-Israel slurs. Local police have opened an investigation. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that he hoped the Knesset's summer recesses would be used as a time to find common ground on judicial overhaul. At the start of his weekly cabinet meeting, Netanyahu said, "I hope that this time the opposition would respond to our extended hand to reach an agreement." Islamic State, aka ISIS, has claimed responsibility for an attack on Sayyad Sanab shrine, which is located south of Damascus, the capital city of Syria. ISIS attackers killed several people and wounded several others. The Islamic State claimed responsibility for the attack in a statement they released on their Telegram channel. The Shin Bet and the IDF have been investigating a weapons smuggling incident that occurred early last week. It was in the northern part of the Jordan Valley. The investigation centers on an unusual smuggling operation that took place at night. Specific details of the incident, which have been described as extraordinary compared to previous smuggling attempts, have not been released to the public because they are under a gag order. We do, however, know that the crackdown on the smugglers involved members of the Israeli Border Intelligence Unit, as well as the IDF forces and the Jordan Valley Brigade. In recent years, Jordan Valley has become, and the crossings have become, the favorite route for smuggling weapons, funds, and resources by criminal and terrorist organizations attempting to infiltrate Israel and the West Bank. Since its establishment, the Jordan Valley Brigade has intercepted thousands of smuggled weapons. We've been thinking out loud about a lot today. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@jbstv.org. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquante piece of information. We saw that great cartoon of Israel and the splitting of Israel and the splitting of the Red Sea. That was the image of it, right? Actually, the Red Sea is not red at all. It's perfectly clear. In fact, it's so clear that when you look at the water, you could see perfectly 20 and sometimes 30 feet down. The Red Sea is perhaps simply a mistranslation from the Hebrew name Yam Suf, which means the Sea of Reeds. That is the sea that Moses split as he led the Israelites on their escape from Egypt. The sea that they crossed, the Sea of Reeds, was marshy, full of reeds. The problem is that the name change only works in English, where clearly the second E from reeds was dropped and changed into red. The Septuagint, interestingly, which is the earliest Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible from about 250 before the Common Era, calls it Erythra Thalassa, which means the Red Sea. Another probable explanation, probably better than this even, is that the fault line right there, the rocks there, are actually filled with ferrous sulfate, which turns the rocks very red. And the mountains are actually called the Red Mountains. Or another explanation is because there was a red flower that bloomed and fell into the water, turning it red. It's all speculation. But the sea is definitely not the color red. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on JBS.